started. Welcome to the last breakout session of the afternoon. The power of the coffee break has proved overwhelming, so hopefully more will come in as we continue. We have a nice group of 3 speakers for this session. The first is Dr. Suzanne Matthews, who's an assistant professor of computer science at the United States Military Academy and an affiliate of the Cyber Research Center at the Academy. And please join me in welcoming her to the stage. And I remind you, when we get to the questions piece, please wait for the microphone to get to you before asking your question so we can capture the question and everybody can hear you. Dr. Matthews.
So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I am Dr. Suzanne Matthews. I am an assistant professor at West Point. My area is computer science. I am not a cyber person, so I apologize if some of these terms might be very, very computer-based, and if you need to stop me and explain what certain things are, just let me know. So my paper is evaluating single-board computer clusters for cyber operations. This is work that was co-authored with Raymond W. Blaine, who's a major and a team lead in the Cyber Protection Brigade, and Dr. Aaron F. Brantley, who is a fellow at the Army Cyber Institute. So the situation that we are going to be discussing today, is that sometimes cyber warfare officers are in tactical environments where they need access to resources that can enable computationally intensive tasks. So deploying systems that can enable this locally is very challenging, especially when they're in actually really warm climates, and they need to move quickly from place to place and have to maintain the security of their data. They're in a tent. Sometimes the power isn't very stable. If the system requires too much power, everything can go kaput. So really, while connecting to some sort of cloud computing environment or a supercomputer is possible, they are reliant on satellite communication. This data has to go through several hops, and this can lead to high latency situations. So we are actually limited by the speed at which we can transfer data and computations. So what would really be ideal is if there was some way that we could run computationally intensive tasks locally. So to eliminate satellite communication and actually give the warfighter the power that they need to run these computationally intensive tasks. So recent years have seen the emergence of these single-board computers. And a single-board computer is exactly what it sounds like. It is an entire computer that is printed on a single circuit board. Some of the most popular examples are seen right over here. All of these are actually credit card sized, and they cost less than $100. So the most popular is the Raspberry Pi. I'm sure many of you have heard of Raspberry Pis. They cost about $35, have a quad-core ARM processor and a gigabyte of RAM. The one that I find personally most intriguing is this device over here. This is the Parallella. And that silver chip is a 16-core coprocessor. Okay, so this baby actually has 16 cores, and actually has a similar power profile to the Raspberry Pi. So this unit consumes about 4 watts of power, this about 5 watts. So it's actually very similar in terms of the power profile, but this one has 16 compute cores. And the ecosystem of single-board computers is actually very, very diverse. There are other devices out there. That's an Odroid C1. This is the Intel Galileo. And the main reason why these devices are so cheap is because they're computationally weak, okay? You compare this thing to, say, a good laptop. The laptop is going to blow it out of the water, okay? That's why most of the applications for these thus far have been acting as like a passive packet sniffing device, an IoT device for collecting data. You can do things like that, and it's very popular in the hobbyist communities. But one thing that researchers started to discover is that if you network these SBCs together, you can actually get a system with non-trivial computational capability. Okay? Perhaps the first attempt at this was Erudith's Pi, which was developed by Dr. Simon Cox out of Southampton. If you take a look, the case is actually Legos. This was a bonding project with his 6-year-old son. So they built a supercomputer together, which is super cute. And so that was just a nice way, and it actually shows some of the educational aspects of these clusters. So the Boise State Pi cluster is actually very interesting. This was actually built by a graduate student. And so he actually had access to an HPC system. And he was getting frustrated because he was in that portion of your dissertation where you're just close to being done and you just want to keep going, and any little thing that gets in your way is like enormously frustrating. And for those of you who may not have used HPC systems before, these systems can be brought down for maintenance, right? If you're dealing with one with a queue system, unless you have a high priority queue, you may have to wait until your job gets completed. So he was getting frustrated with waiting and having to deal with downtime, etc. And so what he decided to do was spend a little bit of money and build his own supercomputer. And he used Raspberry Pis to do this, and what he found is that he was able to get enough computational power to complete his dissertation. And so he actually used this cluster to complete a portion of his dissertation. And of course, you can build SBC clusters with any kind of SBC. It's not limited to a Raspberry Pi. You could use QB boards, this is also by Odroid, or Parallelus. It really doesn't matter. Okay, so my co-authors and I looked at this and went, could an SBC cluster be what we could use to create that platform for doing computationally intensive tasks locally for low cost and at a very good power efficiency? So what we were interested in knowing was, how can single board computer clusters help cyber warfare soldiers in OCO and DCO applications? So what we did is we built 2 SBC clusters, both which were to be half the cost, or at most half the cost, of a high-end laptop. And then we measured different things about it and did a performance study. So the cluster on the far right is a Raspberry Pi cluster. It has 128 compute cores, which are ARM RISC processors. It costs about $1,800 to build, weighs about 15 pounds, and consumes about 174 watts of power. So this power profile is similar to that of a desktop. The next one is our Parallella cluster. So this is 8 Parallelas for 128 Epiphany compute nodes. Compute cores. It weighs approximately 5 pounds, and it consumes about 74 watts of power. So now we're in the range of a laptop. And the super sexy device you see over here, this is a MacBook Pro, which is, the picture of elegance and everything. And it costs about $4,000. So you do pay for this ultra portability and beauty. It weighs only about 3.5 pounds and consumes about 50 watts of power. So it has a quad-core processor. I will point out here that a core is not a core is not a core. Okay? You cannot look at the sheer number of cores and think, oh, well, because this system has more cores than that system, this system must be more powerful. Okay? That is not the way it works. The cores in the MacBook, they are CISC cores. These are powerful Intel i7 cores. I mean, these are that's a really powerful processor. Meanwhile, your ARM cores, this is the stuff you'd find in a smartphone, right? They're not very powerful at all, and that's one of the reasons why they don't draw as much power, okay? So we were interested to see how this actually compares in terms of performance. Okay, so how do we compare performance? The way we decided to do this is to run a computationally intensive application. So what that means is we wanted to run something that will really put the system through the ringer and really force it to use all the computational resources that are available to it. And so we chose the application of password cracking, mainly because password cracking is fun and it is of interest to the cybersecurity arena. And we used John the Ripper. John the Ripper was chosen because it works on all three systems. It is architecturally agnostic in our case, which is very desirable because the Parallella is novel new architecture. Not many things support it yet. And we were very lucky that John the Ripper was actually ported to the Parallella by Katja Malvoni and Solar Designer, who wrote John the Ripper. So that's what we chose. So what we did is we selected 5,000 random passwords from a collection of the 10,000 most common passwords, which was a collection compiled by Mark Burnett, who is a security researcher. We salted each password with a unique salt. We hashed it with bcrypt, and that gave us 5,000 unique hashes. Now, in bcrypt, you have an option of varying the cost parameter, the salt cost parameter. And what this does is it actually slows down the rate at which you can hash a password. And usually with salt, you want to have a hash that is slow enough to dissuade a brute force attack, but fast enough not to frustrate a user who's trying to do authentication. So we use salt costs of 5, 8, and 10. Why? Well, because this is what Malvoni did in his paper. Okay, so then we measured how fast each system can crack password files. Both the Raspberry Pi cluster and the MacBook, we used the fork option so that way we can use all the cores on the system. We also used MPIs for both of our clusters, so not only can we leverage all of the compute cores, we can also leverage all the nodes as well, so that way we can access every single compute core on our system. So let's see. Okay, so the first thing I did is that we measured cracks per second. That's the term that was used in Malvoni's paper. I think if you look at the John the Ripper documentation, it's technically crypts per second. And essentially this is a common statistic that John the Ripper actually outputs that tells you how fast cryptographic hashes are computed. Okay? And if you take a look, and this is really not surprising at all, as the salt cost increases, the average number of crypts per second decreases. Okay? This makes sense. Slower hashes means that it's going to take a longer time to actually compute them. So for the Parallella, you can see that it's 1205. And one thing I should say is that when Malvoni and Solar Designer ported the John the Ripper to the Parallella, I'm pretty sure that number is over all 16 of the Epiphany cores, while these two numbers, which is the original John the Ripper 1.8, that is for one core, because I did try and measure it on all 4 cores or on 1 core, and I still got the same number. So keep that in mind as well. So this is a common statistic. Malvoni actually used this statistic in his paper, and our numbers are actually very consistent with that of Malvoni. But I don't like this benchmark for a number of reasons. So first of all, this doesn't really give us a good sense of time. It does say cryptographic hashes per second, but I actually wanted to know how does this practically translate into time. The second thing I don't like about it is that it's really only for one SBC or one device. We have a cluster of devices, so I really wanted to have a measure that actually says what is the raw time over many, many devices. So that is what we measured next. So the first thing we did is we varied the number of cores and the salts for each of our different clusters, and unsurprisingly, you can see that as I increase the cost, it's going to take an order of magnitude of time longer to crack. But this is the really interesting thing, because our MacBook Pro, the best time for a salt cost of 5 is about 4.4 hours. The Raspberry Pi can do it in about 71 minutes. The Parallella cluster can do it in 45 minutes. Okay? So already it's about 5.8 times faster than our laptop. As we increase the salt cost, our numbers get better. Okay? The MacBook Pro takes 34.3 hours. The Pi cluster takes 9.25 hours. The Parallella cluster takes 5.82 hours. And this one was really perhaps the most stunning, was that our MacBook Pro took 5.77 days for a salt cost of 10. The Raspberry Pi cluster could break that same password file in 1.58 days. And the Parallella cluster could do it in 23.25 hours. Okay, so this is a preliminary, study. This was just something that we did to see how well could our clusters really compete with a laptop, a really portable device that soldiers commonly use on the battlefield. And what this tells us is, hey, these clusters, we could actually do something really good with this, because the Parallella cluster, which has a similar power profile at 74 watts, actually is up to 6 times faster at this application than the laptop. So maybe it is actually worth it to explore other OCO and DCO applications for our clusters. Okay. The other thing I'll mention is that these clusters are very portable. Every SBC is roughly the size of a credit card. I was going to bring one, but I forgot, so I apologize for that. But take a credit card out of your wallet, look at it. That's basically the size of an SBC. So basically, every single soldier can take an SBC and put it in their pocket, and when they need to come together, they can go combine their powers like Captain Planet, if you remember that show, build a cluster that actually satisfies what they need computationally. Okay. Also, it's very portable, which is very good. So if you need to quickly, pack up and go, you can just break apart the cluster if you need to move quicker. There's a shared NFS drive, just yank that out and go. Or for extra security, the operating system is actually stored on these micro SD cards. You can just pop those out and take those with you. Done. Okay, so what are potentially some future OCO and DCO applications? So the two that we decided to focus on is ingress into intranet-enabled devices and counter-RPA. So I'm going to start with intranet-enabled devices. There is a ridiculous ecosystem of intranet-enabled devices. There's many heterogeneous systems out there, and the truth of the matter is that they're so poorly secured. We have more devices that are being created, and people really aren't paying attention to security. And of course, as a result, these systems can be weaponized. Look at what happened yesterday. From what I can tell from what I'm reading on the news, they think they took a bunch of internet-enabled devices to create that massive DDoS attack that took down several DNS servers for quite a while. Okay, so some internet-enabled devices are protected by pins. Well, you can actually use an SBC cluster to brute force these pins. Okay, so the famous recent example was the San Bernardino phone, or sorry, the phone by the San Bernardino terrorists, and even if the phone got locked, there was a researcher in Cambridge who figured out how to clone the chip so you can do it an unlimited amount of time. So there are ways around this, and then you can use an SBC. So counter RPA. So RPA is remotely piloted aircraft, more commonly known as drones. So we do use drones for surveillance purposes, but recently we also have discovered that drones could be weaponized. I think it was earlier this month that someone part of ISIS actually weaponized a drone and used it to kill some soldiers, which was horrendous. And this actually makes this problem of having a counter RPA strategy more pressing. We need a way to actually take down these drones. So researchers at the Army Cyber Institute developed this nifty device called the Cyber Rifle. And basically what it does is it has a known vulnerability in a parrot drone. And what that vulnerability does is it actually sends out a shutdown signal. So if you see a parrot drone, you can just point at it and the drone kind of drops to the ground. So that's the parrot drone. So what does this mean tactically? Well, one thing you could do is if you capture an enemy drone, you can load its operating system and use a dictionary of known vulnerabilities. So this is tying us back to John the Ripper, which was a dictionary-style attack. And you can use the SBC cluster to actually scan the operating system for vulnerabilities and finish it at a factor of n times faster for n nodes. Okay, and the other thing is those vulnerabilities could be a starting point for that dictionary of vulnerabilities could be a starting point for fuzzing, and that can actually help us find new types of vulnerabilities. And so if the enemy has a certain type of drone they're using, being able to do that immediately in a tactical environment will give us the necessary vulnerabilities we need so we can actually load that into our cyber rifle or any other devices to help us take down drones quicker. All right, DCO applications. So the two we decided to focus on in the context of this paper were distributed IDS, IPS systems and ICS SCADA. So I'm going to start with IDS, ICS. So common systems are things like Bro, Snort, Suricata, etc. The whole point is that they are used to monitor networks for malicious activity. And most of these have like some sort of multi-instance feature or can actually be excuse me, the snacks are too rich. So they can be deployed in some sort of distributed environment. And that's really good because that means they're actually very trivial to deploy on these SBC clusters. And you can actually then create your own custom IDS IPS system that is air-gapped that you can use to protect your own network. Okay. So ICS SCADA, and this one's actually something that I'm particularly interested in because I have a colleague at West Point who works with me on this stuff. So basically with SCADA systems, they are used to monitor and secure our nation's cyber physical infrastructure like power, the power grid, water treatment plants, nuclear facilities. And the way it really works is there are these RTUs which have these sensors. The sensors produce data. The data flows into something called a phaser data concentrator if you're dealing with a smart grid or some other control system. And that data then needs to be scanned for anomalous events. The anomalies, let's say we're going to concentrate on the smart grid because that's what my colleague does research on. You want to find anomalous variations in power, etc., because the sooner you find those things, the sooner you can detect that something is wrong, the sooner you can help prevent a blackout. Because usually when things start going wrong, they start to go wrong very quickly. So the sooner you can find an anomaly, the sooner you can actually give the grid operators the information they need to respond and actually fix the system. So basically, a SBC cluster can be used for anomaly detection. You can actually send time slices of data to the cluster. The cluster can, once again, do a scan of the data by splitting it up over all the nodes and then using its multiple cores to scan for anomalies, and therefore reduce the amount of time by at least a factor of n. And that increases operator responsiveness. And I actually have a group of cadets who are working on this right now as part of their capstone project. So that's basically all I have for you right now. There are other opportunities to go forward. There's lots of other SBCs out there. The Raspberry Pi is actually getting more powerful. The latest model has a 1.2 gigahertz processor. How am I doing on time?
Doing great. We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Start us off. So, Suzanne, thank you for that talk. I'll be still selfish. I'll take the first question. For me, the interesting part is not so much what we can do with this, but how our low-tech adversaries at a low cost can close asymmetrically the gap between us and them, and how that can affect us. My question is, have you considered what is the upper bound of the systems like this? And did you consider network architecture and how that would affect the connection, the speed at which those systems operate?
So what do you mean by a network architecture?
So have you considered it, is it a flat network? Is it a toroid? Is it a cube system?
Oh, I see what you mean. So the actual topology of the interconnect.
Correct.
So, right now our system is actually very small, right? We're talking about 32 nodes or 8 nodes in the case of our parallella. So we didn't actually look at things like toroidal meshes or dragonfly interconnects or anything like that. And at the end of the day, I want to stress that this is not meant to replace supercomputers, right? Obviously, any of the things that we're doing here can be done with a supercomputer. The point is that we're talking about a small number of devices. I'm sure you could scale things up where a toroidal mesh or things like that are actually possible, but at that point, there's so many devices that it might not actually be worth it because then we start losing our power efficiency. The whole point about this is to have a cluster that does not consume a lot of power. And the moment we start talking about scaling it up, there really is no big benefit of having the system compared to some sort of HPC system.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm not so much worried about power in my application environment, but I am worried about cost.
Yes.
So the question I have is more, I'm not going to go into the woods with any of our gear from my lab or deploy it to Southwest Asia. But have you thought about using any of these inexpensive cluster hardware implementations for like constructing ranges or other kind of training spaces?
So in terms of, for training spaces, do you mean in terms of education?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, yes. So I didn't mention it in this talk because I thought it was ancillary to the topic, but I'm actually part of a community called CS in Parallel. We are a group of educators who are trying to train the workforce more in parallel computing, and microclusters is a strategy that we have all explored. And so there is a coalition of several faculty across the United States that are looking at this for particularly that purpose. I have used the Parallella personally for education as well as the Raspberry Pi. So absolutely, one thing that we believe is because these systems are very tactile and they are immediate, they really can help students learn about computing and get them excited about that. Because at the end of the day, we have way too many people who don't know what parallel computing is and what they can be used for. And if we are going to help protect our country, we do need students and the people who are familiar with these systems so we can help protect national interests.
Hey, can I just ask a follow-on question? You don't need to bring the mic.
I think
for the video. Oh, for the video. Sorry, which my colleagues are watching back in Texas and spying on me. And then follow-up question is, do you feel that the students, because of that, have a better experience than if they were going to learn using a lot of virtual machines on real physical slices that are more abstract to them? I mean,
absolutely. We have data suggesting that. So we have a paper under peer review right now about using microclusters for teaching PDC concepts. One of my colleagues has made the argument that when a system is not immediate, right, you can talk so much about the theory and how there are these interconnects and everything, but actually seeing a physical interconnect and seeing the light. So for what he does, he has a system called QtPi because it is, because it's a combination of a Raspberry Pi and CUDA. So he has an NVIDIA Jetson board. And so he actually wheels this into all levels of computer science and interdisciplinary courses. So as he sends the message, he actually shows the Ethernet ports lighting up. So you can actually see the message being sent. And so from his own experience, this gives the students more understanding of what's going on.
one more.
Hi, Suzanne. So I love the cuteness aspect of the Raspberry Pis and all, but I don't really envision soldiers carrying Raspberry Pis and coming together. I do envision soldiers walking around with smartphones or equivalent devices, tactical devices in the future. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on the challenges or opportunities in terms of repurposing, dynamically repurposing a cluster of soldiers without bringing them together, so that I am leveraging the devices on 40 soldiers around me for a specific OCO or DCO task.
So I will challenge this whole notion that, I mean, yes, the Raspberry Pi is cute, but it's also a SBC which can be reprogrammed. The difficulty of something like a phone is that there isn't really IDEs, etc., that can allow those things to be used for a different purpose than its stated goal, right? Modern phones are basically designed for the user, the end user in mind. It is not easy to reprogram these devices and still be able to use it for a phone. So because we do have the same computational capabilities, because these are ARM chips, the same things we find in a phone, we do have the programmability, but still the same small form factor.
All right, well, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Mr. Michael Asante. He's a SANS lead for industrial control systems and SCADA security, and the co-founder of Next Defense in Atlanta. He has a long history in cybersecurity and is a former naval intelligence officer. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Asante.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Okay, I want to start out by telling you I have no math in this presentation. 0. But this is a policy paper. And there's 2 theories as to why I might have written this policy paper for this audience. The first theory is that I had the honor of presenting at ACI conferences before, which they gave away this really cool ACI badge, right? This badge, being a former naval officer, this badge says, "Go Army, beat Navy." And it could be that I'm a really bad firmware reverse engineer, and I need a 3rd badge in order to get it to say, "Beat Army." So that's one theory why I'm here. The second theory is that over the last year, I've had the opportunity to go and investigate and look at an incident in the world that had profound effects, I believe, and implications on policy. And one of the policies that I think, because of the context of the event in which it occurred, has a lot to do with the military implications of cyber and our policies when it comes to domestic homeland security, but also military preparedness. So this paper is about looking at the implications of cyber in anti-access and area denial counters. So what I chose to do is to take a lens of opponents or adversaries and say, what are their strategies? How do their strategies come together? And what does that mean from a cyber perspective? Okay, we all talk about cyber conflict, but really looking at what these strategies require became the basis for me to really start thinking about our policies and our preparedness when it comes to things like cyber defense. And in particularly, working with, in the US Army, with the cyber protection brigades, and those folks that are learning missions to conduct defensive cyber operations, are we having the real national debate as to how to employ those forces in a way that makes sense? Okay? So if you think about A2AD strategies, and there's different flavors and versions around the world depending on the country, but primarily speaking, their objective is to make it costly for their opponent to achieve and maintain sea control, to operate in airspace closer to enemy forces, bases, and infrastructures. They want to push those assets out. They want to make it very hard to develop a robust situational awareness of the battlefield and the environment and where you're going to operate. They want to make it painful to concentrate your forces and develop strategic options, and make it hard to rely upon in-theater assets and leverage out-of-theater capabilities. That's an interesting aspect to cyber. In fact, I think it should cause us, from a military planning perspective, to consider A2AD as an opponent's offensive strategy that we need to resist. And of course, the Navy's doing that. The Navy's put a lot of good minds to the fact of some of these new weapon systems and how to counter them and operate regardless of them, not to allow them to deter us to operate. But we should also consider this as a potential defensive priority. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about it. So A2AD capabilities. So in the physical world, we're very aware, I use a Pacific theater example or model, if you will, to talk through this. So the idea is when I bring my forces into an area, there's a constraint naturally to what I'm trying to deny. And typically, luckily for us, it's typically pretty close to the enemy, if you will. However, if you think about cyber forces, certainly they're going to be engaged in disrupting military operations within those areas of denial. but they'll probably reach far beyond that. In fact, lots of writings suggest, and capabilities might suggest, that critical infrastructure way out of theater, possibly to prevent the proper mobilization of the type of military forces you bring into the environment, might be an objective, what we'll call a prolonged or a extended A2AD strategy. So, is that happening today? It's a question. It's a question that we often ask ourselves. Are there intrusions into our critical infrastructure that might be the focus not of espionage or not of economic intelligence gathering, but are pre-positioning in order to provide a capability for one of these strategies? So many scholars do believe that both space and cyber forces would uniquely possess this capability of achieving longer-reaching physical A2AD effects, right? To play with the chessboard, if you will, in an area that they want to deny. We're seeing some limited effects of cyber and electronic warfare against assets already in certain parts of the world, and particularly in Ukraine. They've seen the ability in specific areas to deny the use of remotely piloted vehicles, for example. And the big question that in my mind was, is it possible for one side to deny the other side the freedom of movement and action inside the cyber systems and globally interconnected networks they rely upon? And one would say, yes, possibly. An adversary could get in there and misuse a computer system or use deception or poison information in such a way that that system could cause real-world physical effects. Now, the second question is, could I develop a strategy that if the adversary is in that environment or those systems to do the exact same thing? Can I limit the freedom of movement and the freedom of action of the adversary within my system? A defensive spin on A2AD. So, why is this so important? Well, by the way, this was a project between me and my son just building this PowerPoint slide. Maybe not as cool as building a cluster computer, but we got together and built this slide together, a little complex. The idea is our integrated way of war is very susceptible to a potential offensive action by an adversary. Not only at the weapons platform and in the extended networks that are required for us to interconnect tactical platforms into warfighting capability, but also very deep into the homeland in which we, or even inside the theater, into foreign infrastructure that's required to support this, right? For us to be able to move material, move equipment, and to power these systems. So it might be there are many exploitable targets, right? In a compounded fashion, could impact mobility, speed, and our ability to be lethal. Because we're really good at turning information and then pushing that information to weapon systems and making the most lethal conclusion of how that information could drive a decision on the battlefield. The problem with cyber, there's lots of things that make cyber very interesting, but one of the problems in this military context is it's hard to see. It's so hard. In the kinetic world, we have what we'll call an escalation ladder, right? I was in the Navy during the very end of the Cold War, and it was really clear we had very visible signals. We would move fleets around. We would make it very clear intelligence assets would come into the area. There'd be shows of forces, be positioned forces. You knew you were leading up to a potential conflict with an adversary. All along the while, there's diplomatic action occurring to try to maybe forestall what could happen or just completely disarm it and not lead to conflict. In the cyber context, though, this battle is taking place, much like undersea warfare, this idea of position for supremacy or position so that you can act in a definitive way to provide options to your military decision makers is happening. It's happening today. You're intruding upon civilian infrastructure, you're gaining persistent access, you're exfiltrating data. At some point, you're crossing over into a place where you have intimate knowledge of that target or network system. And you are positioned in such a way that you can deliver a capability, ultimately speaking, if asked to. All that time before this big escalation, you have potential exposure to war, and I want to talk about that. When you execute, it might be part of the strategy that happens either before conflict or during conflict, but clearly you've done a lot of work ahead of time. And it sets up for a very interesting situation where just by positioning or developing options could absolutely be construed as an attack by itself, especially when the target is either civilian infrastructure or a strategic military system. So just that work. One would argue just the work of espionage traditionally and understanding in trying to take information, what's the fine line between espionage, intrusion for espionage purposes, and an intrusion that could lead to some positioning or capability. Well, Ukraine on December 23rd, 2015 experienced an attack against 3 distribution utilities, which resulted in power being out for an average about 3 to 6 hours. Now, this attack was important on several dimensions. Okay? The first dimension was, this was an attack against civilian infrastructure in the wintertime, denying power, a lifeline service to the population of Ukraine during the winter. One could say that's not a good situation. The second aspect of that is, what had happened if the attackers were caught in the lead up to positioning their capability? What if the Ukrainians became aware that these 3 utilities had not only intrusions, but were prepared to shut the lights off? Is it just these 3 distribution utilities, which only resulted in 225,000 people being without power? Or is this just the 3 they're aware of, and there's 10 more, or 15 more, and that the nation is about to be put into a blackout scenario across a large swath of geographic area, and that could be followed by some military action, right? Because it'd be very difficult to mount your defense without power, at least to begin to respond and react and mobilize. So there's a very interesting dilemma here, which is if they were caught before they were about to do it, where enough capability was recognized as a capability and intent that this is about to happen, the size and scope of the attack might have been misconstrued by Ukraine, NATO, others, that, hey, this is a strategic attack against the country. I actually contend the attackers picked 3 distribution utilities because it was just the right size. If you're to send a signal or message that I have a capability, it was enough to fly under the radar, if you will. It definitely caught people's attention, but there wasn't a huge political reaction around the world that a civilian infrastructure was attacked in the wintertime by cyber means. The last thing the Ukraine situation really suggested to me in studying it and deconstructing what the attackers did is that the prevention-based controls, or I'll call the cyber hygiene, and our typical corporate view of security was completely insufficient. The Ukrainians had all the security controls you'd expect. They had firewalls, they had IDSs, they had endpoint security. The attackers used very targeted attacks against human beings. Of course, spear phishing is always ultimately going to work. I liken it to if you think about the Mongol campaigns, they really surprised the Russians and the Western Europeans in that in the wintertime, we didn't fight, we stopped, right? Everything froze up, we didn't fight. Well, the Mongols used that frozen terrain to move massive amounts of distance. In fact, even in citadels, when the river froze, there wasn't a gate over the river because no one attacked each other in the wintertime. So the Mongols would rush right in, and they were really good at siege warfare in the wintertime. We live in a cyber winter when it comes to security awareness, like people clicking on attachments and opening up macros saying, good enough. So these adversaries took advantage of this, and all the preventions failed. What was very clear is they had no concept of operating to detect and respond to and actively disrupt an attacker within their systems. And we are like that today in U.S. critical infrastructure. We do not have an active defense methodology in order to do that. Now, the United States military is developing a defensive concept of operation that includes disrupting an adversary in their own networks. So it might be that it's vital to equip and empower defenders with the training necessary to counter, contain, and ultimately remove threats. Critical infrastructure is very unique in that what we're used to having, even if you look at a national policy level, a very reactive response to a major cyber attack. Okay? We rush in people to help forensically understand what occurred and to assist in reconstituting an environment. Well, in a power system, a real-time system with lots of legacy technology deployed in large numbers in field substations, if you're attacked at a deep enough level, there's no abandoning and walking away from rebuilding servers. You have the technology you have, and the adversary is there and is capable of acting. And so the question is, we have no strategy for disrupting those attackers in place in a real-time system and being able to remove those threats and regain enough integrity to either turn parts of the system back on again. Because what's interesting about cyber is, in Ukraine, what we saw was just disruption of power by opening circuit breakers by the adversary. But destruction of the control system, because they used kill disk to overwrite servers and host master boot records, so they didn't have their control systems available to them to turn the power back on. Now the Ukrainian system is a very, like our rural system was about 10 to 15 years ago, it wasn't very automated, so they manually reclose power and they could do that, restore power, and take that risk. We couldn't do that with a lot of our utilities in the United States. And so what if, though, it wasn't just destructive to the ICS, what if they had techniques which would cause, if operating the system could deny important things like protective relaying so that you could lose transformers. So now the power outage isn't measured in hours, it's measured in weeks to months. Now who's going to make the decision to turn the power back on? So who's the forces being called in to actually actively fight an adversary environment like that in order so we can turn the power back on because the power needs to be back on? We don't have that methodology. So another thing, I used to work at a major utility. I was a chief security officer of American Electric Power, one of the largest utilities in the United States. As a critical infrastructure operator, I might be required to shoulder the burden to establish what I'll call a defensible environment. So there's some level of diligence and technologies that I need to have in place, a lot of the prevention programs we just talked about, a limited capability to detect and respond. But against a military adversary in a military campaign, I would argue that I might need to be supplemented or augmented by people who do know how to disrupt attacks and get good at it and experience it. And together, maybe we can defend that environment. That would obviously require defenders from both civilian infrastructures to military and intelligence organizations to integrate their understanding and knowledge and actually practice together. We don't do that today. There's a little bit of experimentation of that in things like the cyber shield exercises. And then the question is, does the legal construct and model exist for this type of cooperation in an active defense scenario? The answer is actually there are some what appears to be very difficult issues. It's more of a policy issue, honestly, than a legal issue because there are powers and authorities. I mean, for example, the National Guard under Title 38 absolutely has the ability to assist law enforcement in something like this, and that might be appropriate force. But if we're actually in a military conflict, well then of course the Department of Defense would have the authorities, and our Secretary of Defense has said as much. But we need to actually have the discussion. It's like we're afraid to. We're treating cyber as a criminal activity or maybe nation-state attacks, but purely in the reactive concept or the reactive lens, which allows us to limit our policy. I'm not sure we've taken it far enough. So what would a cyber A2AD concept look like? Well, honestly, if attackers are attacking our critical infrastructure, for example, to reduce the military's ability to mobilize in a scenario, well, we could deploy cyber defensive forces and offensive forces in such a way to either A, attack the attacker systems, if the attacks are remote and interactive, to attack that infrastructure from where the attacks are coming from. The Ukraine attack was completely remote and interactive. You might actually identify, track, and disrupt activity in global networks, depending on how distributed that attack might be. And then finally, at the target itself, depending on how deep and whether we missed them or not, how deep they might be embedded. And oh, by the way, they might have already delivered capabilities autonomously. They don't need that remote interaction to conduct their attack or follow-on attacks. Well, then we need to be operating inside this environment to detect, disrupt, and safeguard the environment. Arguably, what we do today is we build a wall around all of this on the right-hand side, and we hope the utility has enough wherewithal to be able to do a little bit of cleanup or a little bit of fighting. The truth is that from a military lens, that's not sufficient to support a military war plan. Why would we give our adversaries that capability and say, yeah, we're just going to hope the best works? Or we're going to have to just buy a lot of generators, okay? Because we might not have power infrastructure. Now, the military models, military forces train in lots of environments around the world. They are bounded, right? We've got Arctic training, we do mountain training, we do desert training. We train to operate. Why aren't we training to operate inside of our own cyber systems and some of these critical infrastructures? We're trying to do a little bit of that, right? There's been a little bit, but my point is there's a serious implication to both civil defense. What does civil defense look like in a modern world? There's a cyber aspect to civil defense. What does war planning look like in this modern, super interconnected world? Our war plans require us to have so much goods to be able to go into a specific area to constitute a plan for us to execute. Well, are those war plans any good if we don't have the infrastructures? The port isn't working, we can't load ships, there's no power. What does that mean to our war plans? I would argue today we don't know what the adversary can do to those work plans. We already have U.S. national infrastructure that has been intruded upon. We know it. We know that we've been compromised. We hope that the adversary is kind of friendly and all they want to know is what's going on, or they're stealing information. Because are they positioned? Well, Melissa Hathaway would say they've already positioned tools. She had a talk earlier today where she said that. It's possible. They clearly have intimate knowledge. The problem is, when you think about cyber, I have always 3 rules I use. Surface knowledge of a target is necessary for access. If I want to gain access, I have to have surface level understanding of my target. If I want persistent access or control, I have to heighten that to intimate knowledge. I need to understand how your architectures are, how capable is your defense. I have to get the right credentials. I have to get intimate knowledge. The last thing is effects. If I want to shut the power off, I need to develop a working model. Enough so that I can do what I want to do with some confidence. Well, we've allowed our adversaries to have the time to not only have access, to develop persistent access, but probably workable models of our infrastructures. There's a broad implication in military war planning for that. We haven't cataloged that. So, what do we need to do? I think we need a national public discussion. Consider how an opponent may use cyber attacks against power systems and means denying us access by degrading our mobility. We need to catalog and evaluate the existing intrusions and compromises into our gas and power infrastructures in the United States. We're aware of them, but I've never seen one complete map of what we think, how deep, and what that might mean. Policymakers need to think about how we might deny an opponent sustained access to those infrastructures. So they're there, now what? How do we prevent the workable model from being put together, options being developed? During the Cold War, we worked with our host nation militaries to devise elaborate plans to defend their infrastructures in case of physical invasion. We probably need to consider that from around the world. Turkey is a great example of we had U.S. forces deployed, and in that host nation, they shut the power off to that base. And it had an effect against our operations. Luckily, some forward-thinking people brought generator techs and everything, and they were able to have some power on parts of this. But we were at the mercy of that host infrastructure. Why are we fighting wars where we depend too much on the host infrastructure in a cyber reality that we have? And then finally, I think a potential cyber element of an opponent's A2AD strategy should prompt us to consider what does civil defense look like in the near future, right? Okay, so I just basically in the paper laid out some recommendations. This is what the nation could do from a policy perspective, and I do think it begins with the debate regarding civil defense in a modern world, and what does that mean for civil liberties? What does that mean relative to how we do business and government, how we interact? I do think there's a strategy there for us to consider from a war fighting perspective. I think we absolutely need to understand the amount of compromise that exists today. What does that mean? What the implications might be to our warfighting plans? I think we need to test the resilience against the risk of long duration outages. So we have to say, maybe it's okay that we can operate through 7 hours of power outage because we can do this, this, and this, but we cannot tolerate 5 days. And if that means we can't tolerate 5 days in San Diego and the Port of Long Beach, then guess what? We better figure out what that means in terms of protecting those infrastructures and what capabilities we might have. And then as the last part of the paper is I kind of provided a scenario, if you will. And it's meant purposely to challenge the current policies and current plans that we have, both from an FBI, DHS perspective. We just had a brand new presidential directive on this very topic. And my challenge is absolutely reactive to history, what we have seen to date. And Sony Corporation attack and incident was significant. It was eye-opening, and the attack against the financial industry relative to DDoSs was important and interesting to formulate it. But I'm suggesting you go further. None of our policies, I believe, were created with the idea that what if some of these attacks are part of a military campaign leading to war? Or in an active, high-intensity conflict over time. These policies and our own plans or procedures don't necessarily take those. We always think cyber is like some really quick point in time. It's either going to be completely reactive or something that we're going to respond to. And quite honestly, going over to Ukraine and being with the Ukrainians and understanding what occurred to their infrastructure and watching their eyes and saying we have no protocol for how to respond, how to now act the day after the attack. So anyway, that's the paper.
Time for questions?
Yes?
You go on your way to the microphone?
Yeah, please.
I guess so. One's coming. And no math. There's no math in there.
Bethany Duff, Army Doctrine. So my question is to you, we've heard a lot about how the government needs to step in and defend us. And the question is, how do we pass laws and policies to defend a nation that doesn't actually want to be defended?
Oh, that's a great question. Doesn't want to be defended. Well, I think we like the idea of being defended. It's just how you go about doing it. I think we have real big problems with. So we do things incrementally, right? So we sit there and say, and someone made a great point this morning. They said some of these problems are problems the market was never designed to deal with, right? This is that example, and in fact, I wrote that paper purposely for that reason, saying the current regimes we have, like I used to be part of NERC, so we have probably the only critical infrastructure cybersecurity regulations out there, other than nuclear power, but we have them in far more a bigger context. But they're not designed for this problem. They're really not. They're designed to require certain controls and its compliance methodology. No one likes it, by the way. There are very real fines associated with it. But it's not the interim tool for this. So the question is, how does that work? Well, people would say, the administration would say, through effective information sharing and voluntary coordination efforts, together, we're going to take care of cybersecurity. My answer would be, no, doesn't really work, because without context and real falling over that log, and that hurt, let's not do that again. Without doing that kind of learning, we won't operate together. And sharing information is going to get you so far. Maybe we'll have a nice picture of what happened, but we're not going to disrupt anything. Maybe we'll have some limited effect. So that's a really good question. The idea would be, and hence the discussion, what does civil defense look like? So if you're talking about a real national defense scenario, a lot of companies would look at and say, I know I worked at a utility, and our first response would be, we're essential to providing a community with a vital lifeline service. If we believed a foreign military was going to try to deny that, we would absolutely figure out how do we work with you to prevent that. And the you probably would be not necessarily the FBI, but probably the Department of Defense, to be honest. Okay? So I think, and we've said that, we're tiptoeing around it. The Secretary of Defense says, yes, we have a role in protecting critical systems in the United States. And then everyone else goes, but it's going to be the FBI, the DHS can help reconstitute. And you go, well, under certain scenarios, yes. Other scenarios, no. That's why I wrote the paper. I hope that answered it a little bit.
Mike, military trains as flights, and we have a lot of good exercises now happening between Department of Defense and utilities and state level. How in the world would you address the uniqueness of the power companies across the U.S.? And how could you ever train the National Guard or the reserves that work in that state to be able to know how to hunt and get rid of the enemy in these uniquely developed systems?
Yeah, it's tough. So first of all, I'd say prioritization. Not all systems matter to mobilization or planning, right? So we prioritize it down to the essential capabilities that we need to have to fight wars and respond to them. The second thing I would say is that what we would need to practice is areas where the cooperation between what's occurring at the target and disrupting something at the attacker side, we don't practice that. We really respect just responding to firefighting. Well, let's talk about disrupting an adversary. Let's practice that. We should probably do that. Third thing is that if the military CPTs get experience at fighting adversaries off on a daily basis on government and DoD systems, well, taking that learning and absorbing it and putting it into the utilities, right, is an important thing to do. If you prioritize, you might be able to do that. I've seen some great collaborations. They're in their infancies, but it's just doing that. Now, the question is, you would never be able to defend the utility by parachuting a team in. It's not going to happen. So that means you have to prepare for, make an environment defensible. And that means having some of these, first it starts with tabletops, and then it starts with real deal stimulated environment, situations where protective relay engineers and dispatchers and operations are working with the cyber protection team and their own cybersecurity force to figure out the right next move. I'm telling you, in Ukraine, it was very clear to me in looking at the utility's inability to make these decisions that there needed to be augmented, and we need to get that capability. Any other questions? One more? All time? All right.
All right, our last speaker today will switch gears for us and talk about something a little less traditional for most distributed networks into mobile ad hoc networks and the defense of those systems. Our next presenter is Geronimo Carvalho. He's an officer in the Brazilian Army with a background in computer engineering, systems engineering, and operations research. He's currently in the radio and radar lab, engineering lab at George Mason University as a doctoral candidate. Please join me in welcoming Geronimo Carvalho.
Hello everyone. Is it working? So I'm Geronimo Carvalho, and I'm working on this project with CMIDS with Dr. Paulo Costa at the George Mason University. This project is sponsored by the Brazilian Army and the CNSQ, that stands for National Council of Technological and Scientific Development. So, CMIDS is a collaborative mobile ad hoc network intrusion detection system. So, collaborative managed IDS. So, here are some topics that I'm going to cover today. And I would like to start by giving you a brief definition about what managed is, so we can have the same idea about what I'm talking about. So what is managed? Managed is a network, a mobile network without infrastructure. So every node is mobile and acts like a router at this network. Whoops. So, okay. So without infrastructure, every node acts like a router. And because of that, frequent disconnections are very typical in this kind of environment. So what kind of adversaries we have here? Basically two, inside and outside. But we are going to focus on the inside adversaries since they are more powerful. And kinds of attacks, well, basically, the most typical are three: denial of service, eavesdropping information, and packet dropping. So how to prevent this kind of attacks? So the thing is with mobile ad hoc network that we do not have a point that concentrates the information. So typical IDS like Snort does not perform well here. So we need specific designed IDS to this kind of network. So usually it's used like secure protocols and watchdog mechanisms like AXXX, but they are intrusive and there is some overhead associated to them. So intrusive in the sense that we are thinking here, CMIDS is being designed to work with legacy systems. So this is a picture, the AV1, an all-view diagram that I'm trying to clarify the kind of scenario that we are dealing with. So we have a MANET, we have a tactical network. All nodes are mobile and they are communicating wireless. And we have an inside adversary that is capable of interact with all of the nodes. So the scope of a problem, well, I already said we are dealing with mobile ad hoc networks. The adversary is powerful in the sense that he already has access to the network, and we are dealing with legacy, so we are not allowed to modify our protocols, our procedures in this network. So CYBERSPACE uses a secondary sensor network to capture using multilateration. It captures, and from that multilateration, it evaluates and finds out the real geographic position of each node in the tactical network. And with this information, it is able to build a kinetic envelope for each node in the tactical network. We associate this information with our mission knowledge, and we are able to identify the attacker, identify the adversary inside our network. So the next slide, I don't want you to spend much time in the topology. Actually, CYBERSPACE works with several kinds of topology, but what is important in this figure is that we have basically three types of nodes. The tactical node, that is the network that we want to protect. We have the sensor node that are working in a collaborative way, and we have a hybrid node. The hybrid node, you may think like a vehicle from the tactical network that has enough room to carry an extra sensor. So it's like two distinguished nodes that are in the same location. So they are like an aggregation. So we are calling like a hybrid node. Okay, so the architecture of CYBERSPACE. On this figure, we have two different contexts. On the left side, we have the context from the tactical network. So we are envisioning that in the future, CYBERSPACE can work with other IDSs. So the box, there's a little one here. Yes. So this is what means the left side of this figure. So the capability for CYBERSPACE exchange information with other intrusion detection systems. But how each node from the sensor network works. So it all starts with listen to the environment. So each node constantly listens to the environment and captures the emissions. This emission can be from the tactical network or from the sensor network itself. If it comes from the tactical network, the sensor will analyze the emission, extract the important information, and store for future calculations through the multilateration process, and will broadcast this information to the other sensors in the sensor network. But if the emission comes from the sensor network itself, it may be of two types. It may be an alert, or it may be an information that another sensor captured from the tactical network. So for the second case, the sensor will just store this information and will not broadcast. But if it is an alert, it will have to process it. Okay, once we have each sensor has enough information about a specific node from the tactical network, it will calculate the true node position through the multiple iteration process. And the next step is to build the kinetic envelope of it. So using now the mission knowledge, the intrusion detection algorithm will evaluate the behavior of this node and will decide if it is an adversary, if it is an attacker or not. So we need to test and evaluate if this idea works. So we choose a few scenarios, and I didn't mention, but I'm presenting today the phase 1 of this project. So for the phase 1, we use just an extra IDS to provide us a baseline, performance baseline. So we chose Snort. Since Snort will enable us to introduce in our system, in our scenario without any modifications. So, and we perform 2 types of attacks: denial of service and eavesdropping. And we used 5 different metrics to provide us how well SMIDS is working, is performing. So the first 2, false discovery rate and time to detect the attack, provide us information to compare SMIDS against the other IDS, in this case Snort. And the following 2, KIA rate and mission accomplished rate, provide us information about the impact of the chosen IDS in our mission. And the last one, that is package delivery rate, provides us information about the health of our network. So we use 3 different simulations tools. On the left side, we had 3 screenshots of VR Force, and we used it to build our scenario and to input our mission. And on the right side, we have Core and eMain, and they are responsible to simulate our physical link and network layers. Core and main are supported by the US Naval Research Lab. So to communicate between these tools, we have to write some Lua scripted tasks. In this phase, we use Snort and 2 kinds of attacks. And I also didn't mention, but CMIDS was written in C language. So results so far. I want to highlight first the false discovery rate. So Snort was better in this metric, but only because it didn't find most of the attacks. So secondly is TDA, that is the time to discover an attack. So CMIDS was able to find out an attacker in 6 seconds, while Snort took more than a minute. And last, I would like to highlight the KIA rate, where using CMIDS, we dropped the KIA rate for almost half. So the numbers here. As a conclusion, I want to emphasize that this is an ongoing working, and I present today just the phase 1 results. But the results suggest that we have an improved IDS. And as future work, we now actually going to phase 3. So in phase 2, we are able to use other ideas like Watchdog and Suricata. We also are using now an extra attack that is package dropping. And what else could I say? Oh, radio configuration. So we are now using not only military radio equipment configuration, but we are also using civilian configuration. So thank you for your attention. This concludes my presentation, and I will be glad to take some answers, some questions, I'm sorry.
All right, well, I'll start off while everybody gets their synopsis firing. Can you speak to the ratio or the size of the network that you need to add for your sensor networks and the hybrid nodes compared to the network, the tactical network that is created?
So for the sensor network first, we have another product on the Radar Lab, and that is about it's about the civil flights. And we have another paper that was published that to precisely identify an aircraft, a commercial flight, we need 5 sensors. So for these simulations, we used 5 sensors. The size of the tactical network doesn't really matter at this point. What we need that the sensor can be able to listen the emissions from the tactical network.
All right, well, I'll follow up with another question. Have you considered, you mentioned they're going to extend the work with other types of attacks. Have you considered how the system might perform if a attack was not to necessarily disrupt the network, but was simply to, as they say, own some of the nodes in the tactical network for other purposes?
Sure. So first, the inside attack, it may be like a capture node.
Sure. Maybe a control, take it over to control some other node in the tactical network.
Yeah, so this is our concern about eavesdropping attacks. So if you capture a node and you are able to interact with other nodes, you are able to learn about your network. So you can analyze the communications and identify, for example, who is the leader of your campaign. And then you can attack specifically these nodes. So you only reveal your position when the attack is done. So these are pretty much one of the primary concerns of this project.
So Suzanne Matthews, West Point. My question has to do, so in a perfect simulation environment, environmental variables are ignored, such as distance, interferences in the wireless signal, etc. Are you planning on trying to test your system in an actual physical environment? And what are the distances that the different things have to be at in order to maintain the network?
Okay, so we actually, this is simulated, so it's not precisely real, but the reason to use core and emailing is to get close to reality. So during our simulations, we use some kind of noise, interference, and so on. We have equipment on our lab that we're in a controlled environment. We can use actual radios to exchange data, and we can simulate it for real. We do not think, at least for now, to get soldiers and go to the terrain and to test this. Not for now. But one of the following phases is to use these gauges that we have on the lab to not only simulate but to test the signal emissions.